I am Elise, 31 years old, and until last Sunday, I still believed my family could change. I spent 2 months knitting a delicate blue blanket for my first nephew. But at the extravagant baby shower, my sister-in-law pinched the fabric between two fingers, dropped it straight into the garbage bin, and announced they only used designer items in her house. I did not scream or cry. I simply fished it out of the trash, smiled with pity, and walked away. What she did not realize was that inside the lining of that handmade blanket was the only thing keeping her husband out of federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers of the Oakwood Country Club cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the worst moment of my adult life. My brother Julian and his wife Brittany were hosting a baby shower that looked more like a royal coronation. 50 guests from the local elite circles mingled with Brittany and her wealthy relatives. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne and expensive appetizers. I sat alone at a table near the back, wearing a simple navy dress, feeling the familiar suffocating weight of being the family disappointment. In their eyes, I was just a broke bookkeeper barely scraping by. The gift opening ceremony began with a sickening display of excess. Brittany sat on a velvet chair surrounded by towering stacks of high-end boxes. Julian stood right beside her, beaming proudly, playing the perfect role of the highly successful luxury real estate broker. When Brittany finally reached my gift, which was wrapped in plain brown paper, her manicured hands ripped it open with obvious disdain. She pulled out the soft blue blanket I had painstakingly knitted by hand. The entire room fell quiet as she held it up. She did not smile. She pinched the corner of the fabric as if it were coated in poison. "Take this away," Brittany said, looking at a passing caterer. "Actually, never mind." She turned and dropped the blanket directly into the tall brass trash can next to her chair. She looked right at me with a cold, calculated smirk. "Elise, I know things are tight for you on a bookkeeper salary, but we only use designer things here. We have Dior babies in and organic Egyptian cotton. I am absolutely not letting my son touch some cheap handmade rag from your apartment. It probably has bacteria." A collective gasp rippled through the crowded room. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I looked at my brother Julian, desperately hoping he would finally step up and say something. He just looked down at his expensive Italian shoes, completely silent. He was the golden child of our family, the man who supposedly owned a thriving real estate empire, yet he could not even muster the courage to defend his own sister against his wife and her blatant cruelty. Before I could even speak, my mother Corinne marched across the room. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. For a brief second, I actually expected her to reprimand Brittany. Instead, she grabbed my arm, her grip painful and tight. "Elise, what is wrong with you?" she hissed loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I told you to just buy a $50 gift card. Why do you always have to make us look bad in front of Brittany and her parents? Look at you. You showed up in that plain dress trying to make a pathetic statement with a homemade gift." I pulled my arm away from her grasp. "I spent 2 months making that for my nephew, Mom. It is a family tradition. Great-grandmother taught me how to knit before she died." My mother rolled her eyes dramatically. "Tradition does not pay the bills, Elise. Your brother is running a multi-million-dollar business and marrying into a prestigious family. Your father Desmond and I spent a fortune on his education so he could elevate this family name. And you are here playing arts and crafts on a minimum wage salary. You are embarrassing, Julian. Just go home." Brittany chimed in from her velvet chair, her voice dripping with fake sugary sympathy. "It is okay, Corinne. We cannot expect Elise to understand our lifestyle. She is just angry because she is 31, single, and still counting pennies for other people. I will just have the cleaning staff sanitize the area around the trash can later." The sheer audacity of her words washed over me like ice water. 10 years ago, this public humiliation would have crushed me entirely. I would have run to my car in tears, wondering why I was never good enough for my own parents, wondering why I was always the scapegoat while Julian could do no wrong. But I was no longer that scared, insecure girl. I was the president of a top forensic accounting firm. I investigated complex corporate fraud for federal agencies, and I knew exactly how Julian was funding this lavish fake lifestyle. I calmly stood up from my chair. I walked straight past my furious mother and approached the brass trash can. The room was dead silent, every eye fixed on me. I reached in, retrieved my soft blue blanket, and carefully brushed off a stray piece of confetti. I looked at Brittany, whose smug smile faltered slightly under my steady, unbothered gaze. Then I looked at Julian. His eyes were wide with a sudden, unexplainable panic. "You are right, Brittany," I said, my voice perfectly clear and completely devoid of emotion. "This blanket does not belong here. I wish your baby the best of luck with those empty designer boxes." I turned and walked out of the ballroom, my head held high, leaving the toxic whispers and judgmental stares behind me. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully put the poor, pathetic sister back in her place. But they had absolutely no idea that by throwing away my humble gift, they had literally thrown away their entire future. I drove back to my luxury penthouse, poured myself a glass of expensive wine, and waited. I knew it would not take long. The drive back to my penthouse in Buckhead took exactly 20 minutes. As the private elevator doors opened into my foyer, I kicked off my heels and let the absolute silence of my home wash over me. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a sparkling testament to the life I had built completely on my own. My family thought I lived in a cramped studio apartment, eating ramen noodles and balancing ledgers for a local auto shop. They had no idea this sprawling $3 million sanctuary belonged to me. I walked over to my custom marble kitchen island and poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet. I checked the gold clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. I took a slow sip of the rich red wine and let the tension of the evening melt away. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Julian was predictably late, but he would call. He always called when the facade of his perfect life began to crack. Right on cue, my cell phone vibrated across the marble countertop. The screen flashed with Julian's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the glass to answer. I did not say hello. I just waited. "Elise." Julian's voice was a frantic, breathless wheeze. He sounded like a man who had just run a marathon in a tailored suit. "Elise, are you there?" "Yes, Julian, I am here." I took another sip of my wine, leaning back against the cool stone counter. "What is wrong? You sound like you are hyperventilating." "Elise, where is the blanket?" He completely ignored my question, his voice pitching higher with every syllable. "Brittany told me what happened at the shower. She said you took the blanket and left. What did you do with it?" "With foam." I smiled into the empty room. It was such a typical Julian reaction. No apology for how his wife treated me. No defense of his little sister. Just panic over what he might have lost. "I brought it home, Julian." "Why do you care? It is just a cheap handmade rag filled with bacteria, remember? That is what your lovely wife announced to 50 of your closest friends." "Elise, please listen to me." Julian was practically begging now, a stark contrast to the silent coward who had stood by while I was humiliated hours earlier. "Brittany was just stressed about the baby. You know how she gets about aesthetics and class image. She did not mean to hurt your feelings. But I got a text from my private courier an hour ago. He said he dropped a package off at your apartment last week. A very specific package from a very specific lender. Is it in the blanket, Elise? Tell me it is in the blanket." My brother was talking about Marcus Vance. Marcus was a private equity lender who operated in the deep gray areas of the law. 2 years ago, Julian, in his infinite wisdom, decided to expand his luxury real estate brokerage by taking a massive off-the-books loan from Marcus. $3 million to be exact. Julian thought he was a genius, but he was just a desperate man playing with fire. The market shifted, properties sat empty, and Marcus called in his debt with a punishing interest rate. Julian was facing not just total bankruptcy, but federal prison for wire fraud due to how he structured the transfers to hide the money from Brittany. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city lights. "Yes, Julian. I said, my voice perfectly calm. The key was woven into the silk lining of the blanket. He let out a loud gasp of relief. Oh, thank God, Elise. Thank God. You have no idea what is happening. Marcus is threatening to take the business. The feds have been sniffing around my accounts. If I do not get that contract and the audit report you promised, I am going to lose everything. I will send a driver to your place right now to pick it up. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the dark red liquid catch the light. You do not need to send a driver, Julian. What do you mean? You just said you brought it home. I did bring it home, I replied. The key to the safe deposit box was in the blanket. And inside that box was the forensic audit report I spent 3 months compiling. The report that would have completely cleared your name and shifted the federal focus away from your brokerage. Also in that box was the signed contract from Marcus Vance. I bought your debt, Julian. I paid the $3 million in full to save your life and your freedom. The line went dead silent. I could hear his ragged breathing through the speaker. You paid it. He whispered, the shock completely freezing his brain. You actually had $3 million. You are just a bookkeeper. I am the president of a forensic accounting firm, Julian, but that does not matter now. Like I said, I bought the debt. I placed the key inside a gift I made with my own hands for your first child. It was my gift to your family. A clean slate, a fresh start. But since your wife proudly declared my gift was garbage and my mother told me I was a worthless embarrassment, I realized something very important. What is that, Elise? Julian's voice was barely a squeak. I realized you do not want my help, I said softly. You only want designer things. So when I got home tonight, I opened the safe deposit box myself. I took out the forensic audit report and the debt relief contract, and I ran them both through my industrial shredder. Julian went totally silent. I could hear the exact moment his heart dropped into his stomach. I placed the shredded pieces in a garbage bag, Julian. I continued, my voice devoid of any sympathy. Because as Brittany pointed out today, we need to know where trash belongs. I finalized the destruction at exactly 1 a.m. Elise, no. Julian's voice cracked, breaking into a guttural scream of absolute terror. You cannot do that. Elise, please. You cannot do this to me. Marcus is going to ruin me. The feds are going to arrest me. I am going to lose my house and my baby. Elise, answer me. I listened to his desperate sobbing for exactly 5 seconds. I remembered all the times he had watched me cry and done absolutely nothing to help. I hope you enjoy the baby shower gifts, Julian, I said coldly. Good luck with the feds. I pressed the red button on my screen, cutting off his screams and leaving my penthouse in perfect, peaceful silence. The next morning, the sun rose over Atlanta, washing my penthouse in bright, warm light. I dressed in a modest beige skirt and a plain white blouse, the kind of inexpensive uniform my family expected a struggling bookkeeper to wear. I drove my sensible sedan to a small strip mall on the outskirts of the city. This was my decoy office. I rented this tiny storefront under a fake name specifically to maintain the illusion of my mediocre life. My actual firm operated out of a high-rise downtown, but my family had never bothered to ask for that address. They only knew about this cramped space with its faded carpet and cheap laminate desk. I had barely unlocked the front door and poured myself a cup of cheap drip coffee when the chime above the entrance rang so violently it nearly shattered the glass. My mother, Corinne, and my father, Desmond, stormed into the tiny reception area. Their designer clothes looked completely out of place against the peeling wallpaper of my fake office. My father slammed his hand down on my laminate desk, making my coffee mug rattle. What kind of sick psychological game are you playing with your brother Elise? He demanded, his face flushed with anger. Julian called us at 2 a.m, having a literal panic attack because of your malicious lies. I took a slow sip of my coffee, remaining perfectly seated. I did not lie to him, Dad. I told him exactly what was inside the blanket Brittany threw in the garbage. My mother stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at my face. Do not you dare blame Brittany for your psychotic jealousy, she shouted. You told Julian you bought his $3 million debt. You told him you shredded the paperwork out of spite. We know you do not have $3 million, Elise. You sit in this pathetic little office counting pennies for local plumbers. You made up a horrible lie just to ruin his baby shower because you are a bitter, lonely spinster. The sheer level of delusion they operated under was almost fascinating. They were so committed to the narrative of Julian as the successful golden child that they could not fathom him actually being in trouble. And they were so committed to viewing me as a failure that they refused to believe I could save him. Julian is drowning in debt to a man named Marcus Vance, I explained, keeping my voice completely level. Marcus is a predator. He is preparing to seize Julian's entire brokerage and hand the files over to federal investigators. I spent the last 3 months using my resources to buy that debt and conduct a forensic audit that would have cleared Julian of the wire fraud he committed to hide the money. The key to the safe deposit box holding those documents was in the blanket. My father laughed a harsh, mocking sound that echoed in the small room. You are delusional, Elise. Julian is opening a new commercial branch next month. He is thriving. You are just trying to extort some kind of twisted apology out of him because Brittany did not want your cheap blanket. Now hand over whatever fake key you are holding hostage so your brother can have some peace of mind. He has a pregnant wife at home, and he does not need your toxic energy right now. I looked at my parents, taking in their righteous indignation. They were so quick to defend the son who was actively lying to them while tearing down the daughter who had tried to save him. You think it is impossible for me to have money? I asked, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. You think it is impossible because you made sure I started with absolutely nothing. What are you talking about? My mother snapped, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater. We gave you a roof over your head. You stole my future, I corrected her, refusing to break eye contact. When Julian was 25 and bankrupted his first tech startup, he owed investors a massive sum of money. You and Dad panicked because your golden boy was going to face legal trouble. So you went into the college fund that great-grandmother left specifically for me. You drained $100,000 from my account without telling me, and you used it to bail Julian out. My father shifted his weight, looking briefly uncomfortable before his face hardened again. That was a family emergency, Elise. Julian was an investment. He needed that money to protect his reputation and launch his real estate career. You were just a girl studying bookkeeping. You did not need an expensive university degree to do what you do. We made a financial decision for the good of the entire family. A financial decision. I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. You left me with $0 to pay for my final 2 years of college. I worked 3 minimum wage jobs. I slept in my car for a month because I could not afford rent and tuition at the same time. You watched me struggle and starve while you bought Julian his first luxury car to celebrate his new business. That is exactly why I learned how to hide my money, Dad. That is exactly why I became an expert in tracking stolen funds. You are living in the past, Elise. My mother waved her hand dismissively, completely ignoring the trauma she had caused. We are talking about right now. We are talking about you terrorizing your brother with some fabricated story about loan sharks. We demand you stop this childish prank immediately. You will call Julian, you will apologize to Brittany, and you will hand over whatever stupid key you put in that blanket. Before I could tell them to get out of my office, the bell above the door rang a second time. The door pushed open and Brittany walked in. She was dressed immaculately in a white designer trench coat, her blonde hair perfectly styled, but her eyes were red-rimmed and frantic, betraying the calm, elegant facade she was trying so hard to project. She did not look at my parents. She marched straight up to my desk and threw a thick legal document down on the laminate surface. It landed with a heavy thud right next to my coffee mug. I am done playing these ghetto games with you, Elise, Brittany said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. Julian has been crying all night, and I am not going to let a jealous, broke loser ruin my family. I had my lawyer draft this up first thing this morning. I looked down at the document. It was a power of attorney and a full asset surrender agreement. It was designed to force me to turn over any and all property keys, contracts, and financial instruments currently in my possession directly to Julian and Brittany. You are going to sign this right now, Brittany demanded, leaning over the desk so her face was inches from mine. You are going to sign over whatever fake assets you claim to be holding hostage, or I swear to God, I will have you arrested for extortion and harassment. Sign the paper, Elise. I looked from the fraudulent document up to Brittany's desperate, angry eyes, and a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I picked up the thick legal document with the very tips of my fingers, as if it were a biohazard. I scanned the first page, noting the aggressive legal jargon and the notary stamp at the bottom, a stamp that I immediately recognized as belonging to a lawyer who had been disbarred 3 years ago for fraud. You really did not do your homework, Brittany, I said, sliding the papers back across the laminate desk. Not only is this power of attorney completely unenforceable, but presenting a forged legal document in an attempt to seize assets is a federal offense. I am not signing anything, and you are not getting a single dime from me. Brittany slammed both hands on my desk, making the cheap plastic surface bow under her weight. You are lying, she shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red. Julian told me you are just a glorified tax preparer. You do not have assets. You do not have power. You are just trying to scare me because you are jealous that Julian chose a real woman to build a family with, instead of ending up a bitter, lonely hag like you. My mother immediately stepped up behind Brittany, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. Do not let her upset you, Brittany, my mother cooed, throwing a venomous glare in my direction. She is just bluffing. She has always been a pathological liar trying to ruin her brother's happiness. I ignored my mother and her predictable defense of her precious daughter-in-law. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I woke the screen and tapped open a highly encrypted file. You see, Brittany? I said, my voice dropping to a calm conversational volume that seemed to agitate her even more. When I bought Julian's debt from Marcus Vance, I did not just wire $3 million and walk away. A forensic accountant does not just balance ledgers. We hunt for the truth. We follow the money that people like you try to hide. I audited Julian's entire luxury real estate brokerage. Every single transaction, every wire transfer, every offshore account. I wanted to know exactly how a man who sold $50 million in real estate last year ended up needing a loan shark to keep his lights on. My father scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. Julian is expanding his business into commercial properties. That takes capital. You would not understand high-level business mechanics, Elise. You just input numbers into a spreadsheet. I tapped the screen of my tablet one more time and turned it around so it faced the three of them. I think I understand business mechanics just fine, Dad, I said softly. Better than your golden boy, anyway. Why do not you take a look at this high-level business mechanic in action? On the screen, a crisp, high-definition security video began to play. It was time-stamped exactly 4 months ago at 2 in the morning inside Julian's private executive office. The camera clearly captured Brittany, sitting at Julian's massive mahogany desk, illuminated by the glow of the computer monitor. Next to the security footage, I had embedded a synchronized screen recording of the actual computer terminal. The room went completely silent as my parents and Brittany watched the video play. In the footage, Brittany was accessing Julian's main construction escrow account. With practiced precision, she initiated a wire transfer of $250,000. She routed it through 2 dummy accounts before dropping it into a limited liability company registered in Delaware. I let the video run for a full 30 seconds, watching the color completely drain from my father's face. That Delaware company is called Apex Holdings, I explained, breaking the heavy silence in the room. It was registered precisely 2 weeks before Julian and Brittany got married. And the sole managing director of Apex Holdings is your brother Hunter. I pulled up the next file showing a spreadsheet of highlighted transactions. Over the last 8 months, Brittany has systematically siphoned over $2 million from Julian's client escrow accounts directly into her brother's pockets. That is why Julian could not pay his contractors. That is why he was facing federal wire fraud charges. That is why he had to go to a dangerous criminal like Marcus Vance to borrow $3 million just to keep the authorities from shutting down his brokerage. He thought he was covering his own bad investments, but he was actually covering his wife's grand larceny. My mother stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at the screen, then at Brittany, then back at the screen. The evidence was irrefutable. It was not a spreadsheet or a printed document that could be dismissed as a typo. It was crystal clear video of her beloved daughter-in-law robbing her golden child blind in the middle of the night. Brittany. My father stammered, his authoritative posture crumbling in an instant. Brittany, what is this? What did you do to Julian's company? I watched Brittany closely, waiting for the collapse. I expected her to fall to her knees to confess, to beg for mercy, or at least offer some pathetic excuse about helping her brother out of a jam. I expected the reality of being caught red-handed, committing federal wire fraud to finally break her arrogant facade. But I had severely underestimated the depths of her manipulation and the sheer power of her weaponized victimhood. Brittany did not faint. She did not apologize. Instead, she let out a loud theatrical gasp and stumbled backward, knocking a stack of files off a nearby chair. She covered her face with both hands and began to heave with loud, violent sobs. "How could you?" she wailed, her voice echoing off the cheap walls of my decoy office. "How could you do this to me, Elise?" She dropped her hands and her face was a mask of absolute, terrified agony. Real tears were streaming down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked at my parents, her eyes wide and pleading. "Corinne Desmond, you cannot possibly believe this is real," she sobbed, grabbing my mother's arm. "It is an AI deepfake. It is completely computer-generated. Elise works with tech companies all day. She paid someone to create this fake video to frame me." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the pivot. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. "An AI deepfake," I repeated flatly. "Brittany, it shows your exact keystrokes. It shows the reflection of your custom engagement ring on the desk glass." She screamed over my words, drowning me out entirely. "You have hated me since the day Julian brought me home," she cried, turning fully to my parents and using her pregnancy as the ultimate shield. "She is racist against me because I am white. She is jealous that Julian loves my family more than he loves her. She is trying to destroy my marriage and put me in jail because she cannot stand seeing us happy. She is a monster, Corinne. She is trying to steal my baby's future." My smile only made Brittany scream louder. She collapsed into my mother's arms, burying her face in the expensive cashmere. Corinne immediately wrapped her arms around her daughter-in-law, stroking her blonde hair while glaring at me with absolute disgust. "I cannot believe you would stoop to this level, Elise," my mother spat, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "Using your computer skills to create a fake video just to frame this poor pregnant woman. You have always been so aggressive, so full of baseless anger." Brittany lifted her tear-stained face, looking at my father with wide, innocent eyes. "She hates me, Desmond. She has always hated me because I grew up with money, and she is just an angry, bitter black woman who cannot stand to see Julian succeeding with a white wife. She wants to destroy the life we built because she could never have it for herself." The audacity of her words hung in the stale air of my tiny office. She was weaponizing her tears, playing the ultimate fragile victim, and relying on the ugliest stereotypes to deflect from her own federal crimes. And the most pathetic part was that my parents were eating it up. They had spent their entire lives trying to assimilate into high society circles, desperate for the validation that Brittany's wealthy family provided. They would rather believe their own daughter was a vindictive monster than admit their golden boy had married a thief. My father stepped toward my desk, his face purple with rage. "You will delete that fake video right now, Elise," he ordered, slamming his fist against the laminate surface again. "You will destroy it, and you will sign that power of attorney before I call the police and have you arrested for digital harassment. You are a disgrace to this family. You are just a jealous failure trying to drag us down to your level." Before I could tell him that the police were the least of his worries, the front door of the office burst open. Julian practically fell into the room. He was sweating profusely, his designer suit wrinkled, and his tie hanging loose around his neck. He must have rushed over the second he realized Brittany had taken the forged papers to confront me. "Julian," Brittany wailed, tearing herself away from my mother and throwing herself at my brother. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing hysterically. "She is trying to ruin us, Julian. She made a fake video of me stealing your money. She is trying to say I took $2 million and gave it to Hunter. She wants to put me in jail and take our baby away. Julian looked over Brittany's shoulder, staring at me with wild, desperate eyes. He gently pushed his wife back slightly, holding her by the shoulders as he looked at the screen of my tablet. The security footage was still playing on a loop. His own office, his own desk, his wife initiating the wire transfers to Apex Holdings. I watched his eyes track the numbers on the screen. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. He recognized the dates. He recognized the missing funds that had forced him to go to Marcus Vance in the first place. The truth was staring him right in the face, undeniable and absolute. I saw his chest heave as he took a shaky breath. I waited for him to push her away. I waited for him to finally be a man to demand answers for the millions she had stolen and the danger she had put him in. But instead, Julian looked at his crying, beautiful white wife. He looked at our parents who were nodding sympathetically at Brittany. He looked around my cheap decoy office and then he looked at me. "You are sick, Elise," Julian said, his voice trembling, but growing louder with every word. "You are completely sick in the head. You manipulated this video just to cause drama." I stared at him, letting the sheer magnitude of his betrayal wash over me. "You know it is real, Julian," I said softly. "You know those dates line up perfectly with the shortages in your escrow accounts. You know she stole from you." "Shut up!" Julian screamed, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. "It is a fake. Brittany comes from a good family. She would never do something like this. You are just a pathetic, angry woman who wants to see everyone else as miserable as you are. I should have known you would pull something like this. You have never supported me. You have always been jealous of my success." He wrapped his arm tightly around Brittany, pressing a kiss to her forehead while she buried her face in his neck, hiding her triumphant smirk. "You are dead to me, Elise," Julian spat, looking at me as if I were something vile he had scraped off his shoe. "You are not my sister anymore. You are nothing to us. Now give me the real key to the safe deposit box, or I swear I will let Marcus Vance know exactly where you live." My mother nodded vigorously, completely validating his threat. "You heard him, Elise. Hand over the key and sign the papers. You have caused enough damage for one lifetime." I sat back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of liberation. For 31 years, I had tried to earn the love of these people. I had knitted blankets, I had overlooked insults, I had secretly bought their debts to save them from ruin. But they did not want saving. They wanted their illusions. They wanted their golden child and his perfect wife, and they were willing to sacrifice me on the altar of their fake prestige to keep that illusion alive. I reached out and slowly closed the cover of my tablet. "I am not giving you the key, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of the emotion they so desperately wanted to see. "And I am not signing the papers. You made your choice. You all did." Julian took a threatening step forward. His hands balled into fists. "You listen to me, you worthless." He did not get to finish his sentence. The screen of my cell phone resting right next to the fraudulent power of attorney suddenly lit up with a bright white glow. It was a text message from a secure encrypted number. The notification banner was large enough for Julian to read perfectly from where he stood. The sender was listed simply as Agent Thomas, FBI Financial Crimes Division. The text message contained only 6 words. "Julian's asset freeze has been approved." Julian stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in his wrinkled designer suit. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My father squinted at the screen, his eyes widening as he read the words, "Asset freeze." "Get out," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Get out of my office before I have the authorities remove you." Julian stumbled backward, grabbing Brittany by the arm and dragging her toward the door. My parents followed close behind, sputtering threats and insults that sounded entirely hollow now. The door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the quiet of my decoy office. I packed up my tablet and drove back to my real life, knowing the war had just begun. I did not have to wait long for Brittany to launch her counterattack. By the time I woke up the next morning, my phone was vibrating off the nightstand. I unlocked the screen to find hundreds of notifications flooding my social media accounts. Brittany had posted a highly edited crying video on Instagram. She sat on the floor of what looked like a nursery clutching a designer baby blanket to her chest. Her blonde hair was perfectly messy, and her tears flowed on command. She sobbed to the camera, claiming that her jealous sister-in-law had launched a cruel campaign to destroy her family. She specifically targeted the prestigious elite church community our parents belonged to in Atlanta. Brittany played the ultimate victim, framing herself as the innocent white wife, being relentlessly attacked by the angry, bitter black sister-in-law. She claimed I was trying to steal Julian's business out of pure spite, and that I had threatened her unborn child. The comments section was an absolute bloodbath. Members of my parents' elite church community people who had watched me grow up were tearing me apart. They called me a disgrace, a jealous spinster, and a toxic burden to my family. The cyberbullying was severe and relentless. My direct messages were filled with venomous insults from strangers and distant relatives telling me I should be ashamed of myself. 2 hours later, the ultimate betrayal went public. My mother and father posted a joint statement on their own social media pages. They officially and publicly disowned me. They wrote that they stood firmly with Julian and Brittany, and that they would not tolerate my malicious behavior. They asked their church community to pray for me because I was clearly suffering from severe mental illness and jealousy. They threw me to the wolves just to protect the fragile illusion of their perfect son. I sat at my kitchen island drinking my morning coffee and scrolling through the endless stream of hate. 10 years ago, this public humiliation would have broken me. I would have called my mother begging for forgiveness, crying and asking what I needed to do to make the bullying stop. But today I just felt a profound sense of peace. I remained completely stoic. They were handing me all the evidence I needed for a massive defamation suit, and they were too arrogant to even realize it. I spent the afternoon working from my penthouse, ignoring the constant buzzing of my phone. Around 3 o'clock, the intercom in my foyer chimed. My private concierge informed me that a process server had arrived with an urgent delivery. I took the private elevator down to the lobby. A man in a rumpled shirt handed me a thick manila envelope and quickly walked away. I carried the envelope back upstairs and opened it on my marble kitchen counter. It was a subpoena. Brittany was officially suing me for defamation, emotional distress, and attempting to extort Julian's business. She had actually convinced a local attorney to file the paperwork, likely promising a massive payout once she secured my fake assets. I read through the ridiculous claims in the lawsuit. Brittany was demanding $5 million in damages and a public apology. She claimed my video had caused her severe emotional trauma and threatened her pregnancy. She thought this lawsuit would scare me into submission. She thought sending a legal threat would force the poor, broke bookkeeper to drop to her knees and surrender. A slow smile spread across my face as I tossed the subpoena onto the counter. They really had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought I was a helpless target they could bully and intimidate. They forgot that I investigated complex financial crimes for a living. I dealt with international fraudsters and corrupt executives every single day. A desperate, spoiled woman playing victim on Instagram was nothing to me. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had kept on speed dial for years. It was the direct line to the senior partner at one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate law firms in the state, a firm I retained specifically for my own company. The line rang twice before he answered. "Hello, Elise," he said, his voice sharp and professional. "What can I do for you today?" I picked up the subpoena and walked over to my window, looking out at the city I had conquered. "I need you to assemble the litigation team," I said, my voice completely steady and cold. "My brother and his wife just served me with a frivolous defamation lawsuit, and they have launched a coordinated public smear campaign against me." I could almost hear the shark-like grin forming on the other end of the line. "Understood, Elise. How would you like us to proceed?" I took a deep breath, letting the last remaining ties to my toxic family shatter and fall away. "Prepare the countersuit," I said. "Include the evidence of the wire fraud, the stolen college funds, and every single defamatory post they made this morning. I want to seize every asset they have left. It is time to teach them a lesson in law." I did not read the text message out loud. I simply picked up my phone and my tablet, slipped them into my tote bag, and walked past my brother and his weeping wife. My parents shouted after me, threatening me with total isolation, but their words felt like empty echoes bouncing off the cheap walls of my decoy office. I drove home knowing the federal machinery was already in motion. The asset freeze meant Julian's business accounts, his personal checking accounts, and Brittany's linked credit cards were entirely locked down. They would not figure it out until they tried to buy their next designer coffee or pay their next exorbitant country club fee. 4 days later, I walked into the downtown offices of Sterling and Vance, a firm known for aggressive civil litigation. This was where Brittany had scheduled our mandatory mediation for her absurd defamation lawsuit. She and Julian wanted to settle out of court, meaning they wanted to bully me into signing away my non-existent life savings to make the fake deepfake video disappear. I stepped out of the elevator onto the 40th floor. The receptionist directed me down a long glass corridor to conference room B. When I opened the heavy door, the scene was exactly as I had pictured it. Julian and Brittany sat on one side of a massive mahogany table. My parents, Desmond and Corinne, sat right behind them, acting as a supportive audience for their victimized daughter-in-law. Brittany was wearing a pale pink maternity dress, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. Next to them sat a man in a cheap gray suit, who I assumed was their aggressively confident lawyer. They all looked up when I entered. Their faces immediately shifted into identical expressions of smug superiority. They expected me to walk in alone, trembling and ready to beg for mercy. "You are late, Elise," my father said, checking his expensive gold watch. "And you brought a lot of nerve showing up here without legal representation. We warned you this would happen when you started spreading malicious lies." I did not answer him. I simply pulled out the leather chair across from Brittany and sat down. I smoothed my navy blue skirt and folded my hands on the bare table. Less than a minute later, the conference room doors swung open again. The smug smiles on my family's faces faltered as two men walked in. They were not cheap public defenders or desperate strip mall lawyers. They were Arthur Hayes and Marcus Sterling, the two most feared former federal prosecutors in Atlanta. They now ran the elite private corporate defense firm that my forensic accounting agency kept on a very expensive permanent retainer. Arthur, a tall man with silver hair and a completely unreadable expression, placed his leather briefcase on the table. Marcus stood silently beside him, radiating a quiet, lethal authority. The lawyer in the gray suit sitting next to Brittany visibly swallowed hard. He recognized them immediately. Anyone who practiced law in this city knew exactly who these men were and what kind of power they wielded. "Let us get straight to business," Mr. Hayes said without bothering to introduce himself. He did not sit down. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of manila folders that looked to be 3 inches thick. He dropped them onto the center of the mahogany table with a heavy thud that made my mother jump in her seat. Brittany's lawyer cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control over the room. "Now wait just a minute," he stammered, adjusting his crooked tie. "My client is the victim of a malicious cyberbullying campaign and severe defamation. We have filed suit for $5 million in emotional damages, and we demand the immediate surrender of the defendant's personal assets as a preliminary settlement. If your client signs the power of attorney today, we might be willing to drop the criminal harassment charges." Arthur Hayes looked at the man with a mixture of pity and absolute boredom. "There will be no settlement," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "My client is not signing anything. In fact, we are here as a courtesy to inform you that your defamation suit is dead on arrival. Everything my client presented to you was entirely factual." Brittany slammed her hand on the table, her face twisting into a furious scowl. "It is a lie," she screamed, pointing her manicured finger at me. "It is an AI deepfake video." She made it on her computer to frame me. "Tell them, Julian, tell them she is a jealous psycho who wants to destroy our baby's future." Julian nodded vigorously, putting his arm around his wife. "My sister is deeply disturbed," he told the lawyers. "You are defending a woman who has lost her grip on reality. We just want to protect our family from her delusions." Marcus Sterling finally spoke. He leaned over the table and tapped the thick stack of folders. These are certified bank records, IP logs, and wire transfer receipts obtained directly from Apex Holdings and your own brokerage accounts. They have been verified by federal investigators. They prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the video is completely authentic. It also proves that Mrs. Brittany Wilson has been siphoning funds for over 8 months to a shell company owned by her brother. He slid a single piece of paper across the table toward Julian. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling continued, we are legally obligated to inform you that as of Tuesday morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has frozen all assets connected to your business and your personal name. The loan you took from Marcus Vance triggered an automated federal audit. My client Elise was originally hired as an independent contractor to trace those funds, but she was entirely removed from the case once the extent of the internal theft became clear. The color completely vanished from Julian's face. He looked down at the paper. It was a copy of the Federal Asset Freeze Order. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as his brain struggled to process the words printed on the page. My father leaned over his shoulder to read it and let out a strangled gasp. This cannot be real, my mother whispered, clutching her pearl necklace. Desmond, tell them this is not real. Our son is a successful broker. He is opening a new commercial branch next month. Brittany's lawyer pushed his chair back, slightly physically distancing himself from his own clients. He looked at Arthur and Marcus with wide, panicked eyes. I was not informed of any federal asset freeze, he said, his voice shaking. I was told this was a simple family dispute over a forged video. You were lied to, Mr. Hayes said calmly. I suggest you advise your client to secure criminal defense counsel immediately, because the federal agents are currently executing a search warrant at her brother's Delaware properties as we speak. The entire room seemed to lose its oxygen. Julian slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The golden boy of our family, the man who had always looked down on me as a pathetic failure, suddenly looked like a terrified child. Brittany was frozen, her eyes locked on the thick stack of evidence sitting in the middle of the table. The tears she had used to manipulate my parents just a few days ago were completely gone, replaced by a stark, naked panic. I sat back in my leather chair, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. I looked at the woman who had thrown my handmade blanket into the garbage. I looked at the woman who had called me a broke loser and tried to steal my entire life savings to cover up her own crimes. I smiled, letting the silence stretch out until the tension was practically vibrating in the air. So, Brittany, I said, my voice soft and perfectly pleasant. With all your accounts frozen and your brother under federal investigation, I am just really curious. How is your new luxury boutique business going? Brittany stared at me, her blotchy red face contorting into a mask of pure confusion. My boutique is perfectly fine, she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. It is located in the most exclusive commercial district in Buckhead. We just signed a 5-year lease and our grand opening is next month. I spent hundreds of thousands on imported Italian marble floors and custom fixtures. You cannot touch my business, Elise. It is completely insulated from Julian's accounts. My family name secured that lease, not his money. I slowly nodded, tapping my fingers against the polished mahogany table. Your family name, I repeated softly. That is incredibly fascinating, Brittany, considering your family name currently carries the stench of a federal indictment. But let us talk about that ironclad lease. Arthur Hayes reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out another pristine manila folder. He slid it across the long table until it stopped right in front of Brittany. Her cheap lawyer leaned forward, sweating profusely as he stared at the document on top. You see, Brittany, I explained, leaning back in my chair. When I audited Julian's brokerage, I did not just look at the money going out. I looked at the properties he was failing to manage. That exclusive commercial building in Buckhead, where you are setting up your little vanity project, was quietly sold 3 months ago because the previous owner was facing bankruptcy. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting between me and the folder. I know about that sale, he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. It was purchased by an anonymous private equity group called Vanguard Holdings. I smiled at my brother, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Vanguard Holdings is not an anonymous private equity group, Julian. It is a subsidiary of my forensic accounting firm. I bought the entire building, which means, Brittany, I am your landlord. The color drained from Brittany's face so fast she looked physically ill. She grabbed the folder and ripped it open, staring at the lease agreement. Attached to the front of her contract was a crisp, legally binding document printed on heavy stock paper. "What is this?" her lawyer demanded, his voice cracking as he read over her shoulder. "This is a notice of eviction." "It is a 4-month eviction notice," I clarified, keeping my tone completely conversational. "According to Section 4 of your commercial lease, any tenant found to be under federal investigation for financial crimes or using stolen funds to secure the deposit is in immediate breach of contract. Since you used the $2 million you stole from Julian's escrow accounts to fund your little boutique, your lease is officially terminated. You have exactly 120 days to pack up your overpriced inventory and vacate my property." My mother gasped, clutching my father's arm. "Desmond, do something," she hissed. "She cannot do this. She cannot leave a pregnant woman without an income." My father slammed his hands on the table, trying to muster the terrifying authority he used to hold over me. "Elise, this is going too far," he barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "You are crossing a line. You are destroying your own family over money. I demand you revoke that eviction notice right now." Marcus Sterling stood up to his full height, towering over my father. "I strongly advise you to lower your voice, Mr. Desmond," he said, his tone laced with absolute menace. "My client owes you nothing. She is exercising her legal rights as a property owner. If you continue to threaten her in this room, we will add harassment to the countersuit." My father shrank back into his chair, silenced by the sheer power of the former federal prosecutor. Julian was completely catatonic, staring blankly at the mahogany table as the reality of his ruined life finally crushed him. He had no money, his business was frozen, his wife was a federal criminal, and now her fake luxury boutique was gone. But Brittany did not freeze. The realization that she had lost everything, that her wealthy facade was completely shattered, finally broke whatever fragile grip she had on her sanity. She pushed her chair back so violently it crashed into the wall behind her. "You cannot do this to me!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. "I am Brittany Vance. I belong in Buckhead. You do not belong anywhere near that district. You are just ghetto trash who got lucky." Her lawyer reached out, trying to grab her arm. "Brittany, shut your mouth right now," he pleaded physically, stepping between her and the table. He looked frantically at the woman sitting quietly in the corner of the room. The court reporter, whose fingers were flying across her stenography machine, was recording every single word. But Brittany was entirely beyond reason. She yanked her arm away from her lawyer and lunged toward the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think because you have a little bit of money now that you are equal to us?" she shrieked, her face twisted into something truly ugly. "You will never be one of us. You are just a loud, aggressive black woman trying to steal what belongs to a real family. Julian only kept you around because he pitied you. No one actually wants you, Elise. You are just a bitter diversity hire playing dress-up in a corporate office." The room fell into a deathly silence. Even my parents looked horrified by the venom pouring out of her mouth. They had spent their lives trying to be accepted by people like Brittany, and now they were watching the mask slip, completely revealing the rotting racism underneath. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked past her violently shaking figure and locked eyes with the court reporter in the corner. "Did you get all of that?" I asked smoothly. The court reporter paused her typing and gave me a curt professional nod. "Every word," she replied. I turned my attention back to Brittany, who was panting heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me with absolute hatred. "Thank you, Brittany," I said, offering her a sweet, devastating smile. "My legal team was wondering how we were going to prove your social media campaign was motivated by racial malice. You just gave us the defamation evidence we needed on the official legal record." Brittany stood frozen as the court reporter stopped typing and looked up with a blank, professional stare. The silence in the glass-walled conference room was so heavy it felt like it could crush the mahogany table. The cheap lawyer sitting next to Brittany frantically shoved his papers into his battered briefcase, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his pen twice. He muttered something completely incoherent. about an immediate conflict of interest and an ethical violation before he practically sprinted for the heavy double doors. He did not look back. He did not say goodbye to his clients. He just ran, leaving Brittany standing there with her mouth hanging open. Arthur Hayes and Marcus Sterling did not even blink. They sat on either side of me, radiating an aura of total control while they watched the magnificent implosion of my family. Julian was staring at the eviction notice lying on the table. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His perfectly styled hair was damp with sweat. The reality of his situation was finally breaking through his arrogant delusion. The federal freeze had locked him out of his own life. He had no access to his business accounts. He could not pay his contractors. He owed $3 million to Marcus Vance, and now his wife was facing a federal indictment for wire fraud. The luxury boutique that was supposed to be their pristine cover story had just been evicted by his own sister. Julian's legs seemed to give out beneath him. He sank heavily into his leather chair and buried his face in his hands. The golden boy of the family, the untouchable real estate mogul, was trembling visibly. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were wide and filled with absolute panic. All the hatred and superiority he had thrown at me yesterday had completely evaporated. In its place was a pathetic, hollow desperation. "Elise, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking, as he leaned forward over the table. "You have to stop this. You have to call off the eviction and tell the federal agents there has been a massive misunderstanding. If Vanguard Holdings takes back that commercial space, we lose the massive security deposit and all the custom build-out costs. That was the last of my liquid capital, Elise. The bank is already threatening to foreclose on our house in Buckhead because we missed the last 2 mortgage payments." He reached across the polished wood as if trying to grab my hand, but Marcus Sterling subtly shifted his broad shoulders and Julian quickly pulled his arm back. Julian was crying now. Actual tears of terror were streaming down his cheeks, ruining his expensive image. "We will have nowhere to go." "Elise," he sobbed, his chest heaving with panic. "Brittany is pregnant. You cannot put a pregnant woman and your own brother out on the street. We are family, Elise. You have to fix this for us. You have always been the smart one with numbers." I sat perfectly still, looking at the man who had spent his entire life treating me like a second-class citizen. I looked at the brother who had threatened to send a violent loan shark to my home just 24 hours ago. He only cared about family when he needed someone to absorb the impact of his own catastrophic failures. He wanted me to save him from a disaster he and his wife had entirely created. I leaned forward, resting my elbows gracefully on the edge of the table, and looked him dead in his panicked eyes. "I am sorry, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and entirely empty of sympathy. "But did you forget? I am just a broke bookkeeper. I just input numbers into a spreadsheet for a living. I do not make those high-level business decisions." My mother let out a loud, dramatic gasp, as if I had physically struck her across the face. "How can you be so cruel?" Corinne wailed, stepping forward to wrap her arms around Julian's trembling shoulders. "He is your brother, Elise. He is suffering, and you are sitting there mocking him. You are a cold, heartless monster." Arthur Hayes closed his manila folder with a sharp, authoritative snap. "My client is not mocking anyone, Mrs. Desmond," he stated, his voice cutting through my mother's hysterics like a surgical blade. "She is merely stating facts. Your son is bankrupt because his wife stole millions of dollars from his escrow accounts. My client simply audited the truth. We are finished here." I stood up and smoothed my skirt, preparing to leave. The power in the room had entirely shifted. I was no longer the scapegoat sister begging for basic respect. I was the one holding all the cards. But my parents simply could not accept their new reality. Their entire identities were wrapped up in Julian's fabricated success. If Julian failed, they failed, and they would rather destroy themselves than admit I had been right all along. My father stepped forward, puffing out his chest, as if he could somehow intimidate the federal prosecutors with sheer volume. "This means nothing," Desmond declared, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Julian is a brilliant businessman. He just hit a minor bump in the road. We will not let you ruin his pristine reputation with these lies. I paused near the door, looking back at my father in genuine disbelief. A minor bump in the road, Dad? I asked softly. His assets are frozen by the FBI. His wife confessed to defamation on a legal court record. He is facing imminent foreclosure. This is not a bump in the road. This is a brick wall. Desmond ignored my words, completely pivoting to his absolute favorite defense mechanism, which was sheer, unadulterated delusion. We will show everyone the truth, my father announced, his voice echoing loudly in the conference room. Julian's real estate brokerage is celebrating its 10th anniversary next month. We are going to host a massive gala, the biggest event this city has ever seen. We will invite all the top investors, all the politicians, and the entire elite church congregation. Corinne nodded enthusiastically, wiping her tears and patting Julian's back. Yes, Desmond, she agreed, her eyes lighting up with a manic kind of hope. We will throw a spectacular gala. We will show the whole world how incredibly successful our son is. Investors will line up to give him fresh capital when they see how powerful he is. This little misunderstanding with the authorities will be completely forgotten once he secures new funding. I stared at them, genuinely horrified by the absolute depths of their denial. They were completely detached from reality. You cannot afford to host a dinner party, let alone a massive gala, I pointed out, keeping my tone perfectly level. Julian's accounts are entirely frozen, and you two spent your entire retirement fund trying to keep up appearances at your country club. How exactly are you going to pay for this spectacular event? My mother lifted her chin, her face transforming into a mask of arrogant pride. We are mortgaging the house, she declared proudly. Your father and I are taking out a second mortgage on our home to fund Julian's anniversary gala. We believe in our son Elise. We support our family unlike you. We will invest everything we have to make sure he gets back on his feet and shows the world who he really is. I stood in the doorway, flanked by two of the most powerful lawyers in the state, listening to my parents eagerly plan their own financial suicide. They were willing to lose their own home just to protect a son who let his wife steal millions. They were willing to risk total homelessness just to throw a lavish party for elite people who did not even care about them. I shook my head, a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust settling heavy in my chest. Good luck with the gala, Mom, I said softly. I turned and walked out of the glass conference room, leaving them to drown in the sinking ship they had proudly built for themselves. Over the next 3 weeks, the city of Atlanta felt like a stage set for a Greek tragedy. The federal investigation into Brittany and her brother accelerated rapidly, and my forensic accounting agency was officially retained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to assist in mapping out the complex web of shell companies her brother had used to launder the stolen funds. Julian's brokerage firm was hemorrhaging clients by the hour. Anyone with any sense of financial preservation pulled their money the moment the asset freeze became public knowledge. Yet despite the absolute ruin raining down on their lives, my family remained completely committed to their delusion. I was sitting in my corner office at Apex Holdings reviewing the final acquisition paperwork for Julian's former commercial building when my executive assistant knocked on the heavy glass door. She walked in carrying a thick envelope made of heavy textured ivory paper. It was sealed with a ridiculous gold wax stamp bearing my family's fake crest. I did not even know we had a family crest. It must have been something my mother invented just for this occasion to make them look like old money. I opened the envelope and pulled out an invitation to the 10-year anniversary gala for Julian's brokerage. The cardstock was absurdly thick, letterpressed with expensive gold foil. It advertised a night of luxury and elite networking at the Grand Plaza Hotel, promising keynote speeches from prominent local investors. I stared at the invitation, feeling a surreal sense of disbelief. My parents had actually done it. They had actually taken a second mortgage on their modest suburban home to fund a lavish party for a son who was currently drowning in federal subpoenas. A small piece of paper fluttered out from behind the main invitation and landed on my desk. It was a single ticket. Unlike the heavy gold foil invitation, this ticket was printed on cheap standard paper. Across the top in bold red letters were the words, "Standing room only." Attached to the ticket with a paperclip was a handwritten note on my mother's personalized stationery. I picked up the note and read my mother's elegant cursive handwriting. Elise, you are receiving this basic admission ticket so you can stand in the back and finally see what true success looks like. Julian is going to secure millions in new investments tonight. When you see how powerful your brother really is, we expect you to come forward and beg for his forgiveness. Bring that trashy handmade blanket you made as a gesture of your apology, and we might consider letting you back into the family. I read the note twice. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection that used to paralyze me when I was younger. I did not feel sad or abandoned. I just felt a profound sense of awe at their sheer stubbornness and absolute blindness. They were literally standing on the tracks watching a freight train barrel toward them, and their only response was to throw a party and demand that I apologize. They truly believed that renting a ballroom and serving expensive champagne would somehow erase federal wire fraud and massive internal theft. Arthur Hayes and Marcus Sterling walked into my office a few minutes later, carrying a stack of legal briefings regarding Vanguard Holdings. Marcus stopped when he saw me holding the gold foil invitation and the cheap standing room ticket. He walked over, picked up the note from my mother, and read it in silence. His usually unreadable face broke into a rare, genuine smile. "This is fascinating," Marcus said, tossing the note back onto my desk. "They are facing imminent foreclosure and criminal charges, yet they spent what little equity they had left on a gold wax seal. I have prosecuted cartel bosses with a better grasp on reality than your parents." Arthur picked up the invitation and shook his head, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "They booked the Grand Plaza Hotel," he noted. "Do they not realize how much a full catered event there costs? They must have drained every last cent from their home equity loan just to pay the deposit. It is a spectacular display of financial suicide." I leaned back in my chair, tapping my pen against the polished wood. "They think this gala is going to save Julian," I explained. "They think if they put on a big enough show, the local investors will ignore the federal freeze and hand him millions of dollars to restart his business. My mother thinks she can simply outshine the truth with a fancy dress and a string quartet. She actually believes I'm going to show up with a blanket and beg for their mercy." Marcus sat down in the leather chair across from my desk. "They do not realize that every major investor in Atlanta already knows the truth," he said. "The financial sector is a small world, Elise. Everyone knows Julian's accounts are frozen. Everyone knows Vanguard Holdings bought his commercial lease out from under him. The only people attending this gala will be vultures looking to pick the bones of his ruined company, or people who just want a free expensive dinner on your parents' dime." I looked down at the cheap standing room ticket. My mother wanted me to stand in the back in the shadows and watch my golden child brother pretend to be a king. She wanted to humiliate me one last time, to put me back in my place as the forgotten scapegoat daughter. She wanted me to bring the blanket she had thrown in the garbage, the blanket I had spent months making for my unborn nephew, and use it as a white flag of surrender. The sheer toxicity of her demand was staggering. She wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would willingly accept my role as the family failure. She wanted to prove to herself that no matter how much money I made or how successful my firm became, I would always be the pathetic girl, desperate for her affection. But that girl died the moment Brittany threw my handmade blanket into the trash. Furthermore, Julian was planning to use this gala to secure unregulated private loans. He was desperate, and desperate men do illegal things. If he convinced these private investors to give him money while he was under a federal asset freeze, he would be committing massive investor fraud. My firm was already assisting the federal agents. Allowing my brother to commit another financial crime in a building my company owned was a massive liability. "Are you going to attend?" Arthur asked, watching my face carefully. "You are under no obligation to subject yourself to their delusion. You have already won Elise. You have everything you worked for, and they have nothing left but a rented ballroom and a mountain of debt." I picked up the standing room ticket and slowly tore it in half. Then I tore it again, dropping the pieces into the wastebasket beside my desk. I smoothed out my navy blue skirt and looked up at my lawyers. "I am absolutely going to attend," I said, my voice steady and cold. "But I am not going to stand in the back, and I am certainly not bringing a blanket to apologize." Marcus raised an eyebrow, a look of sharp understanding crossing his face. "And how exactly will you be attending?" he asked. I smiled, thinking about the primary sponsor list for the Grand Plaza Hotel. Vanguard Holdings was the largest corporate stakeholder in that particular hotel chain. We literally owned the hospitality group that managed their elite event spaces. Julian and my parents thought they were hosting an event that would put them back on top of the Atlanta elite. They had no idea that they had rented a ballroom in a building where I was considered the highest tier of corporate royalty. "I will be attending as the primary corporate stakeholder," I told Marcus, standing up and walking over to the window that overlooked the city skyline. "I will be wearing a custom gown, and I will not be hiding in the standing room only section. I am going to walk through the front doors as the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings and the owner of the Grand Plaza Hospitality Group. I want my parents and Julian to see exactly what true success looks like when it walks right up to their head table and cancels their fraudulent party." I turned away from the window and walked over to the small sitting area in my office. On the glass coffee table sat a simple white shopping bag. I reached inside and pulled out the handmade blanket. I ran my hands over the soft knitted yarn. My mother had called it trashy in her cruel little note. Brittany had literally tossed it into the garbage during her tantrum weeks ago. She did not know I had quietly retrieved it from the kitchen bin on my way out of their house that day. They had no idea what this fabric actually was. The soft pale yellow yarn was not bought at a discount craft store. I had carefully unraveled and respun the wool from a vintage coat that belonged to my great-grandmother. She was the only person in our family who ever showed me an ounce of genuine, unconditional love. While my parents were busy grooming Julian for a hollow corporate throne, my great-grandmother would sit with me on her porch teaching me how to knit and telling me that my sharp mind was my greatest asset. She left me that coat when she passed away, and I spent months transforming it into a blanket for Julian and Brittany's baby. I wanted the child to have a piece of the only pure love this family had ever known. But the sentimental value was only a fraction of what made this blanket so important. I sat on the leather sofa and carefully separated the thick double-knit layers at the bottom edge. I had sewn a hidden pocket into the seam secured with a tiny invisible zipper. I slid my fingers inside and pulled out a crisp white envelope. I opened the envelope and spread the contents across the glass table. First was a certified trust check for $500,000. I had spent years building my wealth quietly, and I wanted to ensure my future niece or nephew had a secure trust fund completely insulated from Julian's chaotic business ventures. It was my gift to the next generation to guarantee the child would never have to struggle the way I did. But the second item in the envelope was infinitely more valuable. It was a heavily encrypted flash drive containing the original unredacted audit report of Julian's brokerage. Before the federal agents froze the accounts before the grand jury subpoenas were issued, I had completed a full forensic sweep of the firm. That drive held the absolute proof that Julian was entirely ignorant of the embezzlement. The data clearly mapped out exactly how Brittany bypassed his security protocols, forged his signature, and funneled the money into her brother's offshore shell companies. It was the silver bullet that would have completely exonerated Julian from the federal wire fraud charges. It proved he was a victim of his own wife. I stared at the drive, shaking my head at the profound poetic justice of it all. If Brittany had just accepted the gift, if she had just shown a single ounce of grace or basic human decency, she would have found the envelope. Julian would have seen the check and the drive. He would have had the exact evidence he needed to hand over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation to clear his name and save his brokerage before the asset freeze destroyed his life. But Brittany was so blinded by her toxic elitism and her hatred for me that she threw it directly into the garbage. In her arrogant rush to humiliate the broke bookkeeper's sister-in-law, she had literally thrown away her husband's freedom and her own financial salvation. She sealed their fate the moment that blanket hit the trash can. As I sat there marveling at the sheer destructive power of their ignorance, the secure private line on my desk phone began to ring. I placed the drive and the check back into the envelope, slipped it into my briefcase, and walked over to my desk. I picked up the receiver. It was my executive assistant patching through a call from one of my most exclusive VVIP clients. The man on the other end of the line was Richard Sterling, a notoriously ruthless billionaire venture capitalist who rarely made public appearances. Elise, he said, his deep voice carrying over the speaker, I just wanted to confirm our meeting tonight. I received an invitation to a 10th anniversary gala for some local real estate brokerage at the Grand Plaza Hotel. The organizers have been begging my office for weeks, claiming they have a massive investment opportunity. I only agreed to attend because I know your hospitality group owns the venue, and I was hoping we could finalize our merger details in the private lounge upstairs. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face as I looked down at the torn pieces of my standing room ticket in the wastebasket. Julian and my parents were not just throwing a desperate party. They had structured their entire financial resurrection around wooing Richard Sterling. They were banking their mortgaged house and Julian's remaining shred of a career on a man who was only showing up to meet with me. I will absolutely be there, Richard, I replied, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly composed. In fact, I think we should have our meeting right in the main ballroom. I guarantee this gala is going to provide an incredibly entertaining return on your investment. I hung up the phone and looked out over the glittering Atlanta skyline from my office window. The game was no longer just about survival, it was about absolute destruction. I placed the encrypted flash drive and the certified trust check back into my briefcase. Julian and Brittany had sealed their own fate, but I was going to be the one to deliver the final blow. The sheer audacity of their plan to solicit new investors while under a federal asset freeze was staggering. The next 48 hours moved with lethal precision. I sat in a secure, windowless conference room at the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in downtown Atlanta. Arthur Hayes and Marcus Sterling sat stoically beside me while 3 lead federal agents and a senior forensic auditor from the Internal Revenue Service reviewed the final operational parameters. We had everything we needed to close the net around Julian and his corrupt wife. The agents clicked through the digital slides of my audit, confirming that my data completely mapped the entire laundering scheme. The senior Internal Revenue Service auditor actually shook his head in amazement at how thoroughly I had traced the stolen funds through the offshore shell companies. They were ready to execute the federal warrants, but they needed to catch Julian in the act of soliciting fraudulent investments to secure the maximum possible sentence. I told them all about the 10-year anniversary gala. I explained that my parents had taken out a second mortgage on their family home just to rent the Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom. I informed the lead agent that Julian was actively trying to secure millions from private investors, including the billionaire Richard Sterling, to bypass his frozen accounts. The room grew incredibly quiet as the federal agents realized the sheer magnitude of my brother's stupidity. They agreed to let the gala proceed, but entirely on their terms. Plainclothes agents would be stationed at the exits and mingling with the waitstaff carrying trays of appetizers. The moment Julian accepted a check or signed a letter of intent, the trap would spring shut. When the evening of the gala finally arrived, I did not feel a single ounce of the anxiety that used to paralyze me before family events. I did not worry about my hair or my weight, or whether my mother would make a snide, cruel comment about my clothes. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse dressing room and watched my own transformation. I was no longer the pathetic scapegoat sister they could easily discard. I was preparing for a corporate execution. I slipped into a custom emerald green silk couture gown that cost more than my parents' first car. The heavy, luxurious fabric hugged my curves and flowed perfectly to the floor, radiating power and untouched wealth. I paired the gown with flawless diamond drop earrings and a simple, elegant diamond collar necklace that caught the light with every movement. I wore my hair swept back into a sleek, polished chignon, and my makeup was immaculate and sharp. I looked like money. I looked like absolute power. I looked exactly like the primary corporate stakeholder of Vanguard Holdings. While I stood in my silent, peaceful penthouse preparing to destroy them, my family was across town, drowning in their own manufactured chaos. The Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom was dripping in expensive floral arrangements and excessive gold decorations. They had paid for top-tier catering and a live string quartet, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Through the live text updates from my hotel management team, I knew exactly what was happening on the ground. My mother was nervously pacing the grand foyer, fixing her cheapened smile every time a guest walked in. My father was sweating heavily through his rented tuxedo, desperately trying to corner local businessmen who were actively avoiding his gaze. Julian was the worst of all. The hotel staff reported that he looked physically ill, downing glasses of scotch in the dim corner while frantically checking the entrance for Richard Sterling. Brittany was beside him, wearing a tight maternity gown. She clearly could not afford glaring at anyone who did not immediately compliment her. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, dancing wildly on the deck of a sinking ship while the band played on. They had mortgaged their home, their future, and their freedom for one single night of fake applause. They were completely unaware that the quiet waiters pouring their expensive champagne were federal agents carrying concealed badges and recording devices. My private driver pulled the sleek black car up to the valet entrance of the Grand Plaza Hotel. The moment the vehicle stopped, the general manager of the hotel rushed out to open my door personally. He knew exactly who I was. He knew my forensic accounting firm owned the entire hospitality group, and he treated me with the absolute deference reserved for the owner of the building. He bowed his head slightly as I stepped out into the warm evening air. "Welcome back, Ms. Elise," he said, his voice full of deep, professional respect. "Everything has been arranged exactly as you requested. Mr. Sterling is waiting for you in the VIP holding area, and the federal security teams are in position." I thanked him and walked gracefully through the grand lobby. The marble floors echoed with the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels. I felt a cold, calculated confidence flowing through my veins. Every step I took was a lifetime of rejection and abuse, finally finding its righteous resolution. I met Richard Sterling in the private lounge just outside the main hall. The billionaire investor took my hand and smiled, fully aware of the trap we were about to spring together. "Are you ready to see a show, Elise?" he asked, offering me his arm. "I have been waiting for this show my entire life, Richard," I replied, taking his arm. We walked past the concierge desk and down the long, gilded hallway, leading directly to the main ballroom. The music from the string quartet drifted through the heavy wooden doors. I could hear the muffled sounds of clinking glasses and the forced laughter of my desperate family. Two hotel security guards stood on either side of the entrance. When they saw me approaching with Richard Sterling, they immediately stood at attention. I paused for just a fraction of a second, smoothing my free hand down the side of my emerald silk gown. I thought about the torn standing room ticket sitting in my office wastebasket. I thought about my mother demanding I bring a trashy blanket to beg for their forgiveness. I thought about the federal agents waiting inside, ready to end Julian's fraudulent reign forever. I gave the guards a single silent nod. They grabbed the polished brass handles and pulled the massive double doors wide open. The bright light of the ballroom spilled out into the dark hallway. The conversation near the entrance immediately died down as hundreds of people turned to see who was arriving so late with the most powerful investor in the city. I lifted my chin, stepped through the doorway, and made my breathtaking entrance into the absolute ruins of my family's empire. The heavy double doors swung open, and the entire ballroom went dead silent. The string quartet faltered and stopped playing mid-note as hundreds of heads turned toward the entrance. I stood there, bathed in the warm light of massive crystal chandeliers, wearing my custom emerald silk gown, with Richard Sterling standing right beside me. The Grand Plaza Ballroom was overflowing with the elite Black society of Atlanta. My parents had spared no expense, spending their final desperate dollars on towering ice sculptures and tables draped in imported velvet. They had built a spectacular stage for a play that was about to be violently canceled. My mother, Corinne, was standing near the front of the room holding a glass of expensive champagne. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she took in my appearance. She had expected a pathetic girl in cheap clothes sneaking into the back room with a handmade blanket to beg for forgiveness. Instead, she was looking at a woman who radiated total, untouched power. Corinne slammed her glass onto a passing waiter's tray and marched furiously toward the entrance. She tried to physically block my path, throwing her arms out wide, her face twisted in an ugly, desperate snarl. "What do you think you are doing, Elise?" She hissed, her voice vibrating with panic. "You do not belong here. You are supposed to be in the standing room section. You are going to ruin your brother's night." Before she could even take another step toward me, my personal security detail smoothly stepped forward. Two massive men in dark suits effortlessly boxed her out, forming an impenetrable human wall between me and her hysterical flailing. They peeled her grasping fingers away from the air near my dress. I did not even break my stride. I glided right past my sputtering mother, leaving her trapped behind my security team, while the wealthy crowd murmured in deep confusion. I walked straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. Julian was standing on the elevated stage at the front of the room, gripping a microphone. He was midway through his desperate pitch for fresh capital-spinning lies about his fake legacy and future growth. The words completely died in his throat the moment he saw me. He was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo looking suddenly too big for his shrinking frame. Then he looked past me and saw Richard Sterling following close behind. Julian's eyes lit up with a pathetic glimmer of hope, thinking the billionaire investor was walking down the aisle for him. He actually believed Richard was his savior. He had absolutely no idea Richard was my client. I climbed the short flight of stairs to the stage. Julian stood frozen in place, completely paralyzed by my presence. I walked right up to him and calmly took the microphone straight out of his trembling hand. He did not even try to hold on to it. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The wealthy investors and local politicians were whispering to each other, trying to figure out why a woman in emerald couture had just hijacked the keynote speech. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive sound system. "My name is Elise Desmond, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings, as well as the primary owner of this hotel. I am also the sister of the man standing beside me." Julian flinched as if the words physically burned him. He finally found his voice, leaning forward, trying to salvage his ruined night. "Richard, please," Julian begged, looking desperately down at the billionaire who was now standing at the front table. "You have to ignore her. She is just a bitter relative who does not understand business. We have a $5 million deal to close tonight, Richard. I have the investment contracts ready to sign in the back room." Richard Sterling stood tall and adjusted his immaculate suit jacket. He looked up at Julian with an expression of absolute profound disgust. "There is no deal," Julian Richard announced, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. "I am officially pulling my $5 million funding offer." The entire crowd let out a collective gasp. Julian stumbled backward, his face turning the color of wet ash. Richard turned his attention to me, giving me a slow, deeply respectful nod. "I only invest where my supreme financial advisor tells me to invest," Richard continued, gesturing directly toward me. "And Elise has made it incredibly clear that your brokerage is nothing but a fraudulent sinking ship. She just saved me from losing millions to your pathetic money laundering scheme." Julian's arrogant mask completely shattered. His legs literally gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto a velvet chair on the stage, burying his face in his shaking hands. The golden boy was completely broken in front of every single investor he had ever tried to impress. Suddenly, a shrill, piercing scream ripped through the ballroom. Brittany pushed her way to the front of the stage, her tight maternity gown bunching awkwardly around her ankles. Her face was bright red with rage, and her eyes were wide with sheer panic. "She is a fraud!" Brittany screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Do not listen to her, she is lying. She is just a broke bookkeeper who inputs numbers into spreadsheets. She is jealous of our success. She is trying to ruin us because she is nothing but a pathetic loser who makes trashy blankets." I stood perfectly still on the stage, looking down at the woman who had tormented me for years. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her hysterical screaming. I simply reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the heavily encrypted USB drive. It was the exact same drive I had hidden inside the seam of the handmade baby blanket. The blanket Brittany had literally thrown into the kitchen garbage because she thought it was cheap trash. If she had just kept that blanket, she would have held the very evidence that was about to destroy her life. She literally threw away her own salvation. I walked slowly over to the main media podium, where Julian's presentation laptop was connected to the massive projector screens hanging behind the stage. The entire ballroom held its breath as I plugged the drive into the USB port. The giant screen behind the stage flickered for a heartbeat before it erupted into a high-definition display of financial records. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as the attendees recognized the official branding of the brokerage firm. One by one, the offshore transfers began to scroll across the screen in red bold text, each entry meticulously documented and time-stamped. These were not just random numbers, but the undeniable trail of $2 million in client funds siphoned directly from the escrow accounts into the private offshore shell companies registered to Brittany's own brother. The room was utterly silent now, the air thick with the weight of absolute proof. Julian looked up at the screen, his eyes darting frantically from the numbers to Brittany, who had gone deathly still at the edge of the stage. She looked small and fragile now, her face drained of all color as she stared at the evidence of her own betrayal projected 30 feet high for the entire Atlanta elite to see. I stepped closer to the microphone, my voice ringing out across the stunned ballroom. That USB drive contains the full forensic audit that would have cleared your name. Julian, I said, my tone calm and cutting. I did not build it to ruin you. I built it because I knew you were being set up. I spent months digging into the back end of your servers trying to protect our family firm from the rot I knew was spreading inside. I put that drive and a trust fund check for our future niece or nephew inside that handmade yellow blanket. I wanted you to have the truth, and I wanted the baby to have security. I spent hours knitting that yarn from my great-grandmother's coat because I wanted that child to be wrapped in the only pure love we ever knew. I looked directly at Brittany, who was now trembling so violently she had to hold onto the stage railing for support. You threw it in the trash, Brittany. You threw away the audit that would have exonerated your husband and given your child a future because you were too arrogant to realize that my work was not trash. You had the evidence to save Julian's career in your hands weeks ago, but your hatred for me was more important to you than your husband's freedom. Julian looked up at his wife, his expression transforming from confusion to a raw, devastating heartbreak. He realized in that instant that his ruin was not an accident or a stroke of bad luck. It was the direct result of Brittany's greed and her desperate need to erase me from the family. He started to sob, not the pathetic whimpering from earlier, but the guttural sound of a man who has lost everything and finally understands who took it from him. He glared at Brittany, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of betrayal and madness. "You did this!" He shouted, his voice cracking as he surged to his feet, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You told me the auditors were coming for me. You told me they were lying. You knew they were yours all along." The elite guests began to scramble toward the doors, their glasses of champagne forgotten on the tables. The gala had officially shifted from a celebration of fake success to a crime scene. Brittany tried to scream something back, but her voice failed her as the sheer reality of the evidence on the screen rendered her unable to speak. She backed away slowly, her hands pressed against her stomach, her face a mask of pure terror as she realized the federal investigators were not just watching the room. They were finally moving in to close the net. The distant sound of sirens suddenly wailed through the night air, growing louder with every passing second. The heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open again, not for guests this time, but for a phalanx of federal agents in tactical gear. The head agent walked straight down the center aisle, looking neither left nor right as he headed for the stage. His presence brought a sudden, icy finality to the room. Every person in that ballroom knew that the party was over. The federal investigation had culminated here in this room under the flashing lights and the weight of my revelation. The federal agent climbed the stage steps, his badge catching the light of the cameras. "Julian Desmond," he said, his voice loud and devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering." Brittany Desmond, you are under arrest for wire fraud and embezzlement of client funds. I took a step back, handing the microphone back to the agent. I watched as they moved in to place handcuffs on my brother and my sister-in-law. My parents were still trying to push their way through the crowd, their faces twisted with a mixture of shame and fury, but it was far too late for their performative denial. I looked at the primary investors in the front row who were watching the scene with cold professional interest. And then I looked at Richard Sterling, who gave me a subtle nod of approval. The net was pulled tight. The truth had been laid bare in the most public way possible. As the agents led Julian and Brittany down the stage steps and out into the night, I did not feel joy, but I did feel a profound sense of closure. The blanket had been thrown away, but the truth it contained had finally come home to stay. The era of my family's beautiful lie was over. Everything they had tried to steal from me had been replaced by the absolute clarity of justice. The gala was finished. The bank would foreclose on the house by morning, and the Desmond name would be remembered for what it truly was. I turned away from the stage, walking toward the exit, knowing that my life was now truly my own. As I turned away from the stage, the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing behind me, my father suddenly broke through the line of hotel security. Desmond was a man who had spent his entire life obsessed with appearances and control, holding himself above everyone else in our family. Now his face was completely drained of blood, and his expensive tuxedo jacket hung off his shoulders like a discarded rag. He rushed toward me, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the marble floor. Corinne was right behind him, her carefully styled hair unraveling and her cheapened gold jewelry clinking frantically as she stumbled forward. The initial wave of federal agents were reading Brittany her rights while she sobbed uncontrollably. But my parents were not looking at their golden boy or his wife. They were looking at me. "Elise, wait!" My father choked out his voice, cracking with a kind of raw desperation I had never heard from him before. He reached out his fingers desperately, trying to grab the emerald silk of my gown, but my personal security team instantly stepped forward, forcing him to drop his hands. He stumbled backward, and to my absolute shock, his knees hit the hard marble floor. He actually fell to his knees in the middle of the Grand Plaza ballroom, right in front of the remaining catering staff and the federal investigators. Corinne dropped down right beside him, the heavy layers of her dress pooling around her on the floor. They were literally kneeling at my feet. "You have to stop this." "Elise," my mother pleaded, tears ruining her immaculate makeup and leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. "You are a forensic accountant. You know how these numbers work better than anyone else in the entire city. You own this hotel, and you have the federal agents listening to you. Please tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you can fix the ledgers. You can find a loophole or create a new financial structure. Julian is your brother Elise. He is blood. You cannot let them take him away. You have to use your firm to save him." My father nodded frantically, his pride completely shattered. "We will give you whatever you want, Elise," he begged, looking up at me with wild, terrified eyes. "We will sign the brokerage over to you. You can be the primary partner. We will make everything right. Just please tell these people to let him go. You are the only one smart enough to untangle this mess." I stood there looking down at the two people who had brought me into this world. I looked at the man who had told me my business degree was a waste of time, and the woman who had demanded I bring a handmade blanket to apologize for simply existing. I searched my heart for any lingering shred of a daughter's love, any small spark of pity for the pathetic figures sobbing at my feet. I found absolutely nothing. The well had run completely dry. There was no anger left, no sadness, and no desire for revenge. There was only the cold, hard reality of the boundaries I had finally built around myself. They looked up at me, their eyes wide with desperate hope, waiting for the obedient scapegoat to step in and clean up their catastrophic mess one last time. They genuinely expected me to use the very skills they had mocked for a decade to rescue the golden child from his own criminal arrogance. They thought offering me a worthless, bankrupt company would suddenly erase a lifetime of emotional abuse. I looked at my father and then at my mother, feeling the ice water flowing purely through my veins. I am just the daughter you kicked out, I said, my voice perfectly steady and incredibly cold. I cannot help you. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Corinne's mouth opened in a silent scream of disbelief while Desmond buried his face in his trembling hands, weeping openly on the floor of the ruined gala. They realized in that exact moment that their power over me was entirely gone. The golden empire they had sacrificed my childhood to build was dead. The generational wealth they had bragged about was nothing but a mountain of federal evidence and frozen assets. They had mortgaged their home, their freedom, and their souls for a complete delusion, and now the final bill had come due. I did not wait to hear another word. I turned my back on them and walked away. I gave a brief nod to Arthur Hayes and Marcus Sterling, who were watching the scene with quiet professional satisfaction. My security detail formed a protective wedge around me, and we walked steadily toward the grand double doors. The rhythmic click of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound that mattered to me now. I walked past the massive floral arrangements that would never be paid for, and past the towering ice sculptures that were already beginning to melt into sad puddles on the imported velvet tablecloths. I was leaving the toxic family in their own manufactured ruins. As I reached the grand foyer, the sound of approaching police sirens wailed loudly outside, cutting through the warm Atlanta night. The heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open, and a second massive wave of federal agents entered the building, their radios crackling as they moved swiftly into the ballroom to secure the rest of the physical evidence and shut down the venue completely. 6 months passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the Grand Plaza Hotel, turning my family's golden empire into a spectacular crime scene. The fallout from that night was absolute and catastrophic. The federal justice system moved with a ruthless efficiency that completely shattered their manufactured reality. Brittany, the woman who had spent her entire life stepping on others to climb the social ladder, was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and direct embezzlement of client funds. My legal team made sure the judge saw every single offshore transfer and every piece of evidence she had thrown away in that handmade blanket. Her designer maternity gowns were replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, and her elite country club friends abandoned her the exact second the handcuffs clicked shut on her wrists. Julian fared no better. The federal government seized absolutely everything he owned to pay back the clients he had defrauded. His luxury vehicles, his frozen bank accounts, and his fraudulent brokerage firm were completely liquidated. He avoided a lengthy prison sentence by turning state's evidence against his own partners. But the plea deal left him absolutely bankrupt and permanently barred from the financial industry. The former golden child of the Desmond family was now working at a sleazy used car lot on the outskirts of the city. My private investigators sent me a photograph of him last week. He was standing in the blistering Atlanta heat, wearing a cheap polyester suit, trying to sell a damaged sedan to a customer who would not even make eye contact with him. His arrogant charm had completely vanished, replaced by the desperate exhaustion of a man who finally realized he was a profound failure. My parents suffered the exact fate they had always been terrified of. The bank foreclosed on their massive estate mere days after the gala. The heavy oak doors were padlocked, and all their imported furniture was auctioned off to cover their mountain of debt. The Atlanta elite black society cast them out immediately, treating the Desmond name like a highly contagious disease. People who had gladly drank their expensive champagne completely erased my parents from their contact lists. Desmond and Corinne were forced to move into a cramped, poorly ventilated 2-bedroom apartment right next to a noisy interstate highway. They had no savings, no assets, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. I was sitting in my top-floor executive office at Apex Holdings, watching a massive thunderstorm roll across the Atlanta skyline. The rain was lashing violently against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, turning the city below into a gray, blurred painting. I was reviewing the final quarterly reports for Vanguard Holdings, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. My business was thriving. My life was quiet and secure. I had completely severed the toxic roots of my past and built an impenetrable fortress of success. My desk phone buzzed, and my head of security spoke quietly through the intercom. He told me there was a woman standing on the sidewalk directly outside the main entrance of my building. She had been standing in the pouring rain for over 2 hours, refusing to leave and demanding to speak with the chief executive officer. He did not have to tell me her name. I already knew exactly who was waiting for me in the storm. I took the private elevator down to the lobby. The marble floors gleamed under the warm recessed lighting, a stark contrast to the violent weather raging outside the heavy glass doors. Two of my security guards fell into step beside me as I walked toward the exit. One of them opened a large black umbrella the moment the electronic doors slid open. The cold rain instantly bit at my skin, but I stepped out onto the granite plaza with perfect calm. My mother was standing at the bottom of the steps, completely drenched. Her cheap coat was plastered to her thin frame, and her hair hung in wet, miserable gray strands across her face. She looked older than she ever had, stripped of her expensive jewelry and her arrogant posture. The water was pooling around her worn shoes, and she was shivering violently in the relentless downpour. When she saw me walking out, surrounded by security, her eyes widened with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Elise!" she cried out, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the thunder and the rushing traffic. "Please, Elise, you have to talk to me. You have to help us." I stopped at the top of the steps, looking down at her from under the shelter of the black umbrella. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The woman standing in the rain was the same woman who had mocked my dreams, isolated me from any genuine love, and demanded I beg for forgiveness while my brother stole millions. "Your father is sick, Elise," she sobbed, taking a hesitant step forward before my security guard subtly shifted, blocking her path. "The apartment is so cold and we cannot afford his medication. Julian can barely pay his own rent. We have absolutely nothing left. You have so much money, Elise. You own this entire building. Please just give us a loan, just a small allowance to help us survive. We are your family. I am your mother. I am so sorry for everything. I will do whatever you want if you just help us." She looked up at me, her hands clasped together in front of her chest, begging for the mercy she had never once shown me. She thought my financial success meant I would automatically revert to the obedient daughter who just wanted her mother's love. She thought the rain in her tears would somehow wash away decades of systematic emotional abuse. I stared into her desperate eyes, letting the cold silence stretch between us until her shivering became even more pronounced. I thought about the standing room ticket she had sent me. I thought about how she had commanded me to bring a trashy blanket to apologize to a criminal. I felt the ice flowing perfectly through my veins, freezing out any lingering ghost of the little girl who used to cry for her affection. "I am just the daughter you kicked out," I said, my voice cutting clearly through the heavy rain. "I cannot help you." Corinne's mouth fell open, and a fresh wave of tears mixed with the rain on her face. She reached out a trembling hand, crying my name over and over again, pleading with the empty air. I did not blink. I did not hesitate. I simply turned my back on her and walked through the heavy glass doors of my high-rise, leaving the toxic family in ruins. I stopped just inside the lobby, the warm air washing over me as I watched my mother through the thick glass. She was still standing there, a pathetic silhouette against the pouring rain, clutching her arms around her chest, her tears mixing with the water streaming down her face. My driver pulled my black town car up to the curb right behind her, the headlights cutting through the dark storm. I looked at my assistant, who was standing nearby holding my briefcase, and I held out my hand. He knew exactly what I needed and silently handed me the thick manila envelope we had prepared earlier that morning. I took a deep breath, feeling the smooth paper under my fingertips, and I pushed the heavy glass door open one last time, stepping back out into the freezing storm. Corinne looked up, her eyes widening as a spark of desperate joy lit up her wet face. She actually thought my return meant she had won. She thought her tears had broken through my armor. "Elise. Oh, thank God, Elise, you came back," she cried, taking a clumsy step toward me, her arms outstretched. I held up my free hand, stopping her instantly in her tracks. "I am not coming back," I said, my voice cutting through the crackle of thunder like a blade. "I brought you this." I held out the heavy envelope. She looked at it confused before taking it with shaking hands. She stared down at the thick wax seal and the embossed logo of my primary legal firm. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "It is an irrevocable trust fund." I explained, my tone strictly professional and devoid of any familial warmth. "It is heavily guarded and locked behind a maze of airtight legal stipulations. It is for Brittany and Julian's baby. I put exactly enough in that account to guarantee that child will have a safe roof over their head and a fully funded college education. But here is the most important part, Corinne. None of you can touch a single cent of it." She looked up at me, her gray hair plastered to her forehead, her mouth trembling. "The money unlocks on the child's 18th birthday." I continued relentlessly, and not a minute sooner. "Until then, the bank will administer the funds directly to the schools or to the landlord. Julian cannot use it to pay off his restitution or fund a new scam. Brittany cannot touch it when she gets out of federal prison, and you cannot use it to buy your way back into your pathetic little country club. That money is completely untouchable by anyone bearing the Desmond name." Corinne stared at the envelope, her hands shaking so violently the thick paper rattled. She looked like she had been physically struck. "But what about us?" she pleaded, her voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. "What about your father and me? We are going to lose everything, Elise. We have nothing to live on. You cannot just leave us like this." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, heavy emptiness. "That is exactly what you get," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried over the storm. "You get nothing. You chose your golden boy. You chose to protect a criminal, and you chose to throw me away. You sat at countless dinner tables and told me I was a disappointment while you funded a liar. The money in that envelope is for the only innocent person left in this family. As for the rest of you, this is the absolute end." I took a step back, moving away from the reach of her umbrella and letting the rain hit my own shoulders. "There will be no forgiveness, Corinne. There will be no emotional reunions, no second chances, and there will be no more contact ever again. Do not ever come to my building. Do not call my office, and do not look for me. If you try to cross this boundary, or if you try to find a loophole in that trust, my lawyers will bury you so deep under legal fees, you will never see daylight again." My driver had stepped out of the idling town car and opened the rear door for me, holding a large umbrella over the leather seats. I did not wait for her to respond. I did not look back to see if she was crying, or if she had dropped to her knees in the puddles again. I simply turned around and slid into the quiet warmth of the car. The heavy door closed with a solid final thud, instantly shutting out the sound of the rain, the roaring traffic, and my mother's desperate weeping. The ride back to my penthouse was completely silent and incredibly smooth. I watched the blurred city lights pass by my window, feeling the last heavy chains of my childhood finally snapping and falling away. When the elevator doors opened directly into my living room, I walked straight past the velvet sofas and the modern art pieces, heading directly for the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire city. The storm was finally beginning to clear. The heavy dark clouds were breaking apart, and the glittering lights of downtown Atlanta were slowly emerging through the thick fog, shining like a million tiny diamonds spread out beneath me. I walked over to my bar and poured myself a generous glass of expensive vintage red wine. I took my drink back to the glass wall and stood there, looking out at the massive, beautiful empire I had built entirely on my own. There were no more ghosts haunting my quiet spaces. The voices that used to tell me I was not enough, the constant whispers of inadequacy and the heavy weight of their impossible expectations had been completely silenced. I was fiercely independent and absolutely victorious. My companies were thriving, my investments were secure, and my heart was finally safe. I took a slow sip of the rich, dark wine, feeling a deep, unshakable peace settling into my bones. It was the peace that comes from surviving the fire and realizing you were the one controlling the flames all along. The toxic era of the Desmond family was permanently over, and looking out at the bright city skyline, I knew that my real life, the one I truly deserved, was just beginning. The greatest lesson we can learn is that our true worth is never defined by people who actively choose to misunderstand us. When blood relatives offer only toxic conditions and endless manipulation, real strength is found in simply walking away. We do not have to set ourselves on fire just to keep toxic family members warm. Building an empire from the ashes of betrayal is about reclaiming your peace, and proving your value comes entirely from within. If you have ever had to build a fortress to protect your peace from those who should have loved you, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys of claiming your true power.